When the lawyer finished reading the will, the room erupted in cruel laughter. The wealthiest relatives had inherited estates, company control, trust funds, and millions in liquid assets. Marin Whitaker, the one person who had actually spent meaningful time with the old man, had been handed the keys to a crumbling house packed from floor to ceiling with what everyone else considered garbage. They called her the family fool. They said she had inherited a junk pit. But the laughter would not last, because hidden behind a false wall, beneath that decaying mansion, was a secret none of them were prepared to face. The mahogany-paneled office of Owen Mercer, attorney at law, smelled of expensive scotch, old leather, and barely concealed greed. Rain hammered against the high windows of the Chicago high-rise, while inside, the Whitaker family waited with the kind of tension that only a massive inheritance could create. Wallace Whitaker was dead. He had been the hard, eccentric patriarch behind the Whitaker shipping empire, and after a long battle with illness, he had left behind an extraordinary fortune, valuable real estate, and a family that had spent years circling around him, waiting to see where the money would land. Marin sat quietly in one corner of the room, her damp coat pulled around her shoulders. She looked out a place among the polished shoes, designer clothes, expensive watches, and carefully practiced expressions of grief. She was the niece who had actually spent time with Wallace, not because of his bank accounts, not because of the company. She had loved the gruff, difficult old man for who he was. They had shared tea, argued about architecture, studied paintings, talked about history, and spent long afternoons discussing the strange stories hidden inside old objects. Across from her sat her Aunt Celeste, dressed in mourning clothes that looked more like something prepared for a luxury fashion campaign. Beside Celeste sat her son Trevor, who was already scrolling through listings for yachts on his phone. Marin's uncle Conrad tapped the silver tip of his cane impatiently against the Persian rug. Owen Mercer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "We now come to the division of the primary assets," he announced. What followed was a parade of unimaginable wealth passed casually from one family member to another. Celeste received the Hamptons estate along with the majority of the liquid assets. Conrad was granted control of the shipping company's board and ownership of the Manhattan penthouse. Trevor received a trust fund, large enough to ensure that neither he nor his future children would ever have to work unless they chose to. Then Owen slowed down. "And finally," he said, looking at the document with a faint expression of confusion, "to my dearest niece, Marin, who alone understood the value of history, I leave the property at 42 Willow Creek Drive in Pennsylvania, together with everything contained inside it." For a moment, the room became completely silent. Then Trevor snorted. "Willow Creek," he said. Celeste pressed one manicured hand against her chest in exaggerated disbelief. "You mean the hoarder house?" she asked. He left her the junk pit. The room exploded with laughter. Even Owen looked apologetic. The Willow Creek house had become a family legend, and not a flattering one. It was a decaying Victorian mansion Wallace had purchased many years earlier. He had never lived there. Instead, he had used the property as a destination for the things he collected during his increasingly strange trips to estate sales, flea markets, bankrupt antique shops, and forgotten warehouses. Whenever Wallace became fascinated with some pile of old objects, the entire shipment went directly to Willow Creek. To the rest of the family, the house was proof that Wallace had become irrational. They saw it as a monument to an aging man's eccentricity and a dumping ground filled with worthless debris. Conrad leaned heavily on his cane and smiled at Marin. "Well, Marin," he said, "perhaps you can open a museum for broken toasters and moth-eaten rugs. If you need a loan for a dumpster, let my assistant know." Marin kept her chin up, though heat burned across her face. "Thank you, Uncle Conrad. I'll manage." Eventually, Marin stood on the overgrown lawn of 42 Willow Creek Drive. The house looked like a rotten tooth, rising from the Pennsylvania landscape. Long strips of gray paint peeled away from the siding. The porch sagged under decades of neglect. The windows were coated in grime so thick that almost no light passed through them. She unlocked the heavy oak front door and pushed it open. A suffocating smell of mildew, stale air, old paper, and damp fabric rolled over her. The inside was worse than she had imagined. There was barely room to walk. Stacks of yellowed newspapers rose from floor to ceiling, forming unstable canyons through the hallways. The living room looked like a graveyard of broken grandfather clocks, rusted bird cages, damaged furniture, bizarre taxidermy animals with missing glass eyes, tangled electrical wires, battered typewriters, corroded tools, and boxes containing objects Marin could not even identify. It was not simply cluttered. It was a maze of garbage. Marin hired a local appraiser named Nolan Hayes, hoping that somewhere inside the mountain of junk there might be enough valuable material to help pay for the cleanup. Nolan spent days working through the first floor. He opened boxes, checked furniture, examined tools, studied books, and inspected whatever could still be reached without risking an avalanche of debris. When he finally stopped, his clothes were covered in dust. "I'm sorry, Miss Whitaker," he said, wiping his forehead. "I don't see anything here worth what this cleanup is going to cost. The furniture is rotted. The typewriters are too damaged. Most of the books have water damage. From what I can tell, this place is exactly what it looks like." He glanced around the room. Junk. Marin thanked him anyway. After he left, the family group chat on her phone kept lighting up. Someone had forgotten to remove her from it. Trevor posted a picture of his new Porsche, with a caption mocking the difference between his inheritance and hers. His inheritance, he joked, went from 0 to 60. Marin's inheritance was a fire hazard. Sitting in a torn velvet chair, surrounded by soot and spider webs, Marin felt tears of frustration burning behind her eyes. Why had Wallace done this to her? They had spent so much time together. He had always told her she had a sharp eye for things other people overlooked. He had encouraged her interest in history, architecture, and art. Had all of that meant nothing? Had he truly lost control of his judgment and left her the physical burden of his obsession? Marin decided she would not give Celeste, Conrad, or Trevor the satisfaction of watching her quit. She rolled up her sleeves and rented a commercial dumpster. If she had to remove 1,000 broken clocks to prove she was not the family joke, then that was exactly what she would do. She started with the ground floor. The work was exhausting. Bags of ruined paper, rotten fabric, broken wood, rusted metal, and useless household debris went out the front door. She cleared the dining room, the kitchen, and the main hallway piece by piece. The deeper she moved into the house, the more something began to bother her. The chaos was not completely random. The newspapers in this kitchen were all taken from the same narrow period and focused heavily on European bank collapses, stolen art, financial panic, and major criminal investigations. The broken clocks in the living room all seemed to be frozen at the same exact setting. Not almost the same, exactly the same. Wallace Whitaker had been eccentric, but he had also been one of the most precise men Marin had ever known. He did not repeat details by accident. The realization hit her hard. Maybe this was not simply a hoarder's nest. Maybe it was camouflage. By the time the first floor had been cleared, Marin's hands were calloused, her shoulders ached, and exhaustion followed her from room to room. But the despair she had felt at the beginning was disappearing. Curiosity had taken its place. She moved to the basement. The cellar door was hidden beneath the main staircase and secured with 3 heavy brass padlocks. That alone made no sense. Why would Wallace protect a basement filled with garbage more carefully than the rest of the house? Marin used an angle grinder to remove the locks. When she finally pulled the door open, a rush of cold, unusually dry air came up from below. She stopped, It did not smell like a damp Pennsylvania basement. It smelled almost sterile. Maren switched on a powerful flashlight and descended the wooden stairs. The basement stretched beneath the house like a dark underground warehouse. Just like upstairs, it was packed nearly to the ceiling. But the objects were different. There were heavy pieces of machinery, rusted engine blocks, giant iron pipes, industrial equipment, and stacks of decaying lumber pressed tightly against the far western wall. While taking a break, Maren sat on an overturned crate and opened a metal lockbox she had discovered earlier in the kitchen. Inside were the original architectural blueprints for Willow Creek House. The fragile paper was old and faded. Maren unfolded the drawings carefully and moved her flashlight across the foundation plan. She studied the measurements. Then she looked at the basement around her. Something was wrong. Maren stood and walked from the eastern staircase toward the wall of stacked lumber. She estimated the distance, then looked back at the blueprint. The basement should have extended much farther. There was a missing section of space, roughly 15 feet deep, running behind the western wall. Her heartbeat began to climb. The lumber had been stacked so tightly that it looked like structural support, but according to the blueprint, the house continued beyond it. Maren grabbed a heavy iron crowbar. She began pulling away the timber. The work was brutal. Old wood splintered under pressure. Dust filled the air. Her gloves tore. Her hands became raw, and every muscle in her arms began to burn. Still, she kept going. When the final massive beam crashed to the floor, Maren stepped backward and raised her flashlight. Behind the lumber was not dirt. It was not the stone foundation of the Victorian house. It was a wall of smooth, modern poured concrete, and set directly into the center of that concrete was a huge brushed steel door. It looked like the entrance to a bank vault. There was no visible handle, no ordinary keyhole, no exposed hinges. Beside the door was a sleek black digital keypad connected to a biometric fingerprint scanner. The technology looked impossibly modern against the decaying 19th century house around it. Maren's crowbar slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. The sound rang through the basement. "What were you hiding, Grandpa?" she whispered. She walked toward the door and touched the keypad. The screen came alive, throwing a cold blue glow across her face. "Enter passcode," it displayed. Maren stared at it. She had no code. She did not have Wallace's fingerprints. For one awful moment, panic rose in her chest. She had discovered the secret, but she was still locked outside it. Maren leaned against the cold steel and slowly slid down until she was sitting on the dusty floor. She closed her eyes. Wallace did not leave things to chance. He had left the house specifically to her. He knew how she thought. If he expected her to find this door, then he must have left a way for her to open it. The clocks. Her eyes opened. Every broken clock upstairs had been frozen at the same 4-digit reading. Maren hurried to her feet and entered that reading into the keypad. A harsh red light flashed. Access denied. Maren stared at the screen. No. What was she missing? She thought about the taxidermy animals, the bird cages, the newspapers, and all the other strange objects Wallace had placed throughout the house. Then she remembered their last conversation in the hospital. Wallace had been weak, but he had suddenly gripped her hand with surprising strength. "Maren," he had whispered, "suffragette isn't in the light. It's in the margins. Read the margins of my favorite story." At the time, she had assumed illness or medication had made him confused. His favorite story. Wallace loved classic literature. For as long as Maren could remember, he had kept one battered first edition beside his bed. The Count of Monte Cristo. Where was it? It had not been in the hospital room when he died. It had not appeared during the reading of the will. Maren rushed upstairs and headed for the master bedroom. It was one of the few rooms she had not completely cleared. Cardboard boxes filled the floor, packed with old clothing and damaged books. She tore them open one after another. Moldy suits, water-stained novels, old magazines. Nothing. "Come on," she muttered. "Come on." At the bottom of one box, her hand touched something heavy wrapped in oilcloth. Marin pulled it free. She carefully unwrapped the cloth. There it was. A faded leather-bound copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. Marin opened the book carefully. The old spine creaked. She studied the margins page by page. Nothing. Only yellowed paper. She checked the front, then the back. Frustration tightened in her chest. Then she noticed something faint on the inside of the rear cover. Written in light pencil, almost invisible against the aged paper, was a 6-digit sequence in Wallace's unmistakable handwriting. 498127. Beneath it, pressed much darker into the paper, was one sentence. "Burn this house down when you are finished." Marin stared at the words. A cold shiver moved through her. Wallace had not simply been eccentric. He had been afraid of something. Marin held the book tightly and hurried back to the basement. The keypad still glowed in the darkness. She stood in front of it, took one deep breath, and entered the sequence. 498127. The screen flashed green. Passcode accepted. Deep inside the concrete wall, massive mechanical components began to move. Heavy bolts retracted with deep metallic impacts. Hidden locks clicked. Gears turned behind the wall. Then, with a hiss of released pressure, the seamless steel door moved outward. Marin grabbed the edge and pulled. The enormous door opened smoothly on hidden hinges. She raised her flashlight and stepped across the threshold. The moment her foot touched the floor inside, motion sensors activated. Rows of bright white light emitting diode fixtures switched on overhead. Marin dropped her flashlight. It rolled across the polished floor. She did not notice. For several seconds, she could not breathe. She could not speak. Her mind simply refused to understand what her eyes were seeing. The family had laughed at her inheritance. They had called Willow Creek a junk pit. But the junk had only been the camouflage protecting a hidden empire. The air inside the secret room was filtered and climate-controlled. Industrial dehumidifiers produced a quiet mechanical hum. The room extended farther than the visible footprint of the mansion above, suggesting that Wallace had excavated deeply beneath the surrounding property. It did not feel like storage. It felt like a private high-security museum archive. To Marin's left stood 6 massive custom shelving systems, filled with identical sealed titanium cases. She walked toward the closest one and released the heavy latches. Inside, resting in molded velvet, were rows of pure, unmarked gold bullion. There appeared to be hundreds of pounds of gold in that case alone. But the gold was not the most shocking thing in the room. Farther inside the vault, Marin discovered a series of climate-sealed, ultraviolet-protected glass display cases. Her college studies in art history suddenly became painfully relevant. Art had been one of the passions that first connected her to Wallace. She approached the first painting. The image showed a fragile boat being thrown across dark, violent waves. Marin stopped breathing. "My God," she whispered. It was Rembrandt's Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee, one of the famous works stolen from the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston during one of the most notorious unsolved art thefts in modern history. The empty frame still hung in the museum, yet the original painting was here, perfectly preserved. Beside it hung Johannes Vermeer's The Concert, another masterpiece taken during the same theft. On a pedestal nearby sat a solid gold Faberge egg covered in diamonds, one of the lost imperial pieces that had disappeared from public view long ago. Marin slowly looked around the room. The truth was becoming impossible to deny. Wallace Whitaker had not been a confused old man collecting broken typewriters. He had been one of the most powerful and well-protected shadow brokers on the eastern seaboard. The shipping empire had provided the perfect cover. At the rear of the vault stood a polished mahogany desk. On it rested a modern laptop, a satellite phone, and a thick leather-bound ledger. Beside the ledger lay a sealed white envelope. One word was written across it in Wallace's elegant handwriting. "Marin." She sat in the leather chair. Her hands began to shake as she opened the envelope. The letter had been written not long before Wallace died. "My dearest Marin, if you are reading this, It means you possessed the one quality the rest of our miserable bloodline never understood: perseverance. You didn't run from the dirt. You dug through it. I'm not a good man, Marin. The Whitaker shipping empire began with legitimate freight, but over the years, its real profit increasingly came from moving things that were never supposed to move openly. Cartel cash, stolen antiques, conflict diamonds from Sierra Leone, illicit assets belonging to oligarchs attempting to bypass federal sanctions. I used shipping containers with hidden compartments to move those assets across the ocean. The wealth I left to Celeste, Conrad, and Trevor is poisoned. The Hamptons estate, the Manhattan penthouse, the trust funds, and much of the liquid fortune were funded through offshore shell companies and foreign banking networks used by the operation. It is criminal money tied directly to the illegal logistics system, documented in the ledger in front of you. I knew I was dying, and eventually the guilt of what I had built became greater than the thrill of controlling it. I still could not bring myself to destroy the empire while I was alive. I was too much of a coward. I left you, Willow Creek, because you are the only innocent Whitaker. You never asked me for money. You only asked me for my time. The ledger contains every routing number, every hidden account, every corrupt customs official connected to our payroll, and the paper trail tying Conrad, Celeste, and Trevor to the laundering operation. The house above you was designed to discourage thieves and family members alike. Nobody looks for $1 billion vault beneath a fire hazard made of rotten newspapers. I leave the choice to you. Walk away or burn the empire to the ground. Love, Wallace. Marin lowered the letter. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Conrad's mocking voice returned to her memory. Perhaps you can open a museum for broken toasters. Marin opened the leather ledger. Page after page documented an enormous network of illegal accounting. Trevor's supposedly untouchable trust fund was connected to money transferred from a known international arms dealer. The Hamptons estate, controlled by Celeste, had been purchased through a shell company already connected to an international investigation involving the smuggling of conflict minerals. Conrad's business interests were threaded through offshore transfers, hidden ownership structures, and laundering channels connected to Wallace's shipping network. If the ledger became public, the Whitaker family would lose more than its inheritance. Federal authorities could seize assets under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. The yachts, penthouses, sports cars, accounts, and trust funds could be frozen and confiscated. Marin pulled out her phone. She began photographing every page of the ledger, every account, every transfer, every name. She photographed the gold, the banking records, and the stolen artwork. Then a heavy sound came from the ceiling above. Footsteps. Fast, heavy footsteps, crossing the first floor. Marin froze. The front door had been locked. "Marin!" a voice shouted from the top of the basement stairs. The anger in it turned her blood cold. It was Conrad. "I know you're down there." Another voice followed. "Trevor." Panic surged through her. Marin shoved the ledger into her backpack, zipped it closed, and grabbed Wallace's letter. A chair toppled behind her as she stood. "The bank froze my accounts, Marin," Trevor shouted from above. Federal agents raided Dad's Manhattan office looking for a master ledger. What did the old man leave you? They had not come to check on her. Federal investigators had already started following the evidence. Wallace had deliberately left exposed before his death. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was closing in, and Conrad had realized that the missing piece might be hidden inside the junk house Wallace had protected so carefully. Marin hurried out of the vault. Her boots crossed the polished floor and hit the dusty basement, just as two flashlight beams swung around the staircase. "There she is," Trevor shouted. He climbed over a pile of rusted pipes, catching his expensive suit on jagged metal. Conrad followed behind him, leaning on his silver-tipped cane. His face was red with panic and fury. "You deceitful little..." He stopped. His flashlight moved past Marin and landed on the smooth concrete wall, then on the open steel vault door. Bright white light spilled from the hidden room into the filthy basement, catching the edges of titanium cases, gold bullion, and priceless paintings. Trevor's flashlight fell from his hand. "What is this?" he whispered. Marin backed toward the vault entrance. "This," she said, "is the real inheritance." Conrad's expression changed instantly. Fear gave way to desperate greed. He shoved Trevor aside. "Move, Marin. The federal agents raided my office. They froze our accounts. If the master ledger is in there, I need it now. We can liquidate the gold and disappear." "It's too late, Uncle Conrad," Marin said, gripping her backpack. "Don't lie to me," Conrad snapped. "Give me the ledger." "It's too late," Marin repeated. She pulled out her damaged phone. "I've photographed every page, every offshore account, every bribe, every transfer. The files have already been uploaded to a secure server. If I don't stop the release, they will automatically be sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation Art Crime Team and the International Criminal Police Organization." The color drained from Conrad's face. "You're bluffing," he said. "You wouldn't destroy your own family." Marin looked at him. "You aren't my family," she said quietly. "You're the people who laughed at me while sitting on a fortune built from money Wallace himself admitted was criminal. He wanted this empire dismantled. I'm finishing what he couldn't." Trevor lunged forward. "Get her phone." Marin moved immediately. She struck the emergency close control on the inner frame of the vault. The enormous steel door began moving. Marin threw herself backward through the opening and landed on the dusty basement floor just before the vault sealed with a deafening boom. The keypad turned red. The stolen art, the gold, and the original ledger were now locked inside the fire-resistant bunker. Marin was outside with Conrad and Trevor. Conrad swung his cane in blind rage. The silver tip struck Marin's shoulder and knocked her into a tall stack of dry newspapers. Pain shot through her arm. "You foolish girl!" Conrad shouted. "The people connected to this operation could come after all of us. Open that door." Marin scrambled backward. Her hand touched the brass lighter that had fallen from her pocket. Wallace's final sentence flashed through her mind. "Burn this house down when you are finished." Suddenly, she understood. He had not meant the protected vault. He meant the camouflage. Marin opened the lighter. A small flame appeared in the darkness. Around them were mountains of dry, brittle newspapers, rotted wood, old fabric, and debris that had filled the house for years. "Don't come any closer," Marin warned. Trevor stopped. "Marin, wait," he said. "This whole place could catch fire." "Exactly," she replied. She tossed the lighter into the paper. Flames raced through the brittle debris with frightening speed, rising between Marin and her relatives. Trevor panicked. "Fire. We have to get out." He turned and scrambled toward the stairs. Conrad stared through the smoke as the false empire around him began disappearing in flame. "You ruined us," he shouted. Then he fled after Trevor. Marin covered her mouth with her jacket and moved toward a small ground-level storm window. She kicked the rusted frame loose, pulled herself through the opening, and fell onto the wet grass outside. She crawled away from the foundation as smoke alarms screamed from inside the house. From a safe distance, Marin watched flames consume the rotting Victorian structure. Sirens were already approaching. She looked at the cracked screen of her phone. Then she opened the prepared message containing the evidence and pressed send. The consequences came quickly. Once the fire was under control, the Federal Bureau of Investigation established an excavation perimeter around the property. The protected vault survived. The discovery of the secret archive, the gold, and the stolen masterpieces became international news. The recovery of Rembrandt's missing seascape alone drew worldwide attention. Conrad was arrested at an airport while attempting to leave the country. Celeste was taken into custody at the Hamptons estate. Trevor's trust funds were seized, leaving him financially ruined and facing federal charges connected to the laundering network. They had laughed at Marin, because she inherited a house filled with garbage. But the garbage had protected the truth they were all afraid of. Marin eventually stood on the balcony of a new apartment in Florence, Italy, holding a small cup of espresso and looking across the city. She had not taken Wallace's criminal fortune for herself. Instead, whistleblower rewards and legitimate insurance finder fees connected to the recovered art allowed her to build a clean fortune of her own. Wallace had been right about one thing. The truth had been buried in the dirt. Marin was the only person willing to keep digging. But the deepest lesson in her story was not about hidden gold or priceless paintings. It was about the difference between value and appearance. Everyone in that law office believed they knew who had won. Celeste had the estate. Conrad had corporate control. Trevor had the trust fund. Marin had a collapsing house full of broken objects. On paper, she looked like the loser. Yet appearances can hide more than wealth. They can hide truth, character, courage, and consequences. Marin kept working when people laughed at her. She kept searching when experts told her there was nothing worth saving. She trusted the part of herself Wallace had always encouraged, the part that noticed what others ignored. That persistence did not make Wallace's actions right. His letter forced Marin to confront a painful truth. The man she loved had built part of his success through terrible choices. He had used legitimate business as cover for a criminal network. An innocent affection could not erase the harm behind that history. Loving someone does not require pretending they never failed. Sometimes love becomes more honest when we are willing to see the whole person, including the choices we wish they had never made. Wallace understood his guilt, too late to repair everything himself. He admitted that fear had kept him from dismantling the empire while he was alive. In the end, he placed that responsibility in Marin's hands. That was not a fair burden, but Marin still had a choice. She could have protected the fortune because it benefited her family name. She could have hidden the evidence and taken the gold. She could have allowed anger and humiliation to decide what she became. Instead, she chose accountability. And accountability does not have to come from hatred. It can come from the quiet understanding that some things should not continue, simply because they are profitable, familiar, or connected to people we love. Her relatives also made their own choices. They mocked Marin when they believed she had nothing. They valued her according to the size of her inheritance. When the truth threatened their comfort, they tried to protect the money instead of facing where it had come from. Those choices carried consequences. The story does not ask us to celebrate anyone's downfall. It reminds us that the way we treat people when we think they have nothing to offer says something important about us. Kindness that appears only after success is visible is not the same as loyalty. Respect that disappears when money disappears was never very strong to begin with. Marin also learned that forgiveness and responsibility can exist at the same time. She could remember the good moments she shared with Wallace, while still refusing to protect the damage he caused. She could let go of the need to hate Celeste, Conrad, and Trevor without rescuing them from the consequences of their own decisions. Forgiveness does not always mean restoring trust. Sometimes it simply means refusing to carry bitterness into the next chapter of your own life. And perhaps that is why the final image of Marin matters so much. She was not sitting on a throne made of stolen gold. She was not living inside the criminal empire she uncovered. She was standing in a new place, living on money she could honestly call her own. The fortune that mattered most was not the one hidden under Willow Creek. It was the freedom to build a life without inheriting the moral weight of the choices that came before her. Sometimes the most valuable thing buried beneath the surface is not treasure. Sometimes it is the truth, and truth can be uncomfortable. It can change the way we see people we love. It can force difficult decisions. It can close doors we once believed we needed, but it can also give us the chance to choose differently. to live more carefully, to treat people with more kindness, to take responsibility before someone else has to carry it for us, and to remember that real character is often revealed when nobody expects there to be a reward. If Marin's discovery kept you listening, share this story with someone who enjoys emotional mysteries, hidden secrets, difficult choices, and unexpected justice. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. And then think about one question. If everyone around you laughed at something they believed was worthless, would you walk away with them? Or would you be willing to look one more time beneath the surface?